Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I want you to cast your mind back to March 2020. The world shuts down.
Oh, yeah.
Events are canceled, offices close, travel just stops. And suddenly, millions of people and businesses looked at their contracts, leases, vendor agreements, wedding venues, and asked the exact same question. Do I still have to pay for this?
It was the single biggest stress test of contract law in modern history.
Sure.
Everyone wanted an out.
Exactly. And that is what we are unpacking today. We're diving into the legal doctrine of excuse. It's this battle between the oldest rule in the book Pax Sunt Servanda, or promises must be kept,
Okay.
and the chaotic reality of life, where wars, fires, and sudden illnesses blow those promises up. The mission today is to figure out, when does a disaster actually let you off the hook, and when are you still on the line for damages?
It's a fascinating area because it really sits right on the fault line between fairness and stability. I mean, if we let everyone out of their contracts every time things get tough, the economy collapses. But if we force people to do the impossible, the law starts to look like a tyrant.
Okay, so let's set the stage. What's our analytical path for today?
I think we should tackle it in three parts. First, the evolution, how we got from this really strict liability to a more modern excuse.
Okay.
Second, we'll break down the three main doctrines. Impossibility, where you literally can't do it. Impracticability, where the cost is just excessive. And frustration of purpose, where you can do it, but it's now completely pointless.
And third.
The critical limits, this is the key part. Foreseeability and assumption of risk.
All right, let's start at the beginning. The law wasn't always very understanding, was it?
Understanding is not the word I'd use, no. The starting point in early common law was absolute strict liability.
So just tough luck.
Tough luck is putting it mildly. The philosophy was that a contract is a voluntary assumption of risk. You chose to bind yourself. If you wanted an out for a disaster, you should have written it into the contract yourself.
If you didn't.
If you didn't, the courts weren't going to save you.
We have a case that really drives this home. Let's analyze Paradine v. Jane. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
So this is 1647 during the English Civil War. A tenant was sued by his landlord for unpaid rent. The tenant's defense was that he couldn't pay because an invading army led by Prince Rupert had kicked him off the land.
So an alien enemy, as the case says, made it impossible for him to actually use the property.
Exactly.
And what was the core legal issue?
The issue is a tenant excused from the duty to pay rent when an opposing army occupies the land, preventing any possible use of it?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
The court applied the rule of absolute contractual liability. The elements are pretty straightforward and pretty harsh. 1, a party creates a duty upon himself by contract. 2, he is bound to make it good. And 3, notwithstanding any accident or inevitable necessity.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, the creation of the duty?
Well, that was easy. The court just noted that the tenant voluntarily entered into the lease. He agreed to pay the rent. The duty was self-imposed.
Understood. Now what about the third element, the accident or necessity? The invasion of an army.
This is the core of the ruling. The court reasoned that the tenant could have provided against this. He could have put a clause in the lease, a force majeure clause.
But he chose not to.
He chose not to. And so the court said the law will not protect him from his own lack of foresight. He assumed the risk.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The defense failed. The tenant had to pay the rent, despite the invasion.
Wow. Okay, so that harshness couldn't last forever. When did the law finally soften to allow an excuse?
It took about 200 years. But we finally get a shift with the rule of implied condition of continued existence.
What does that mean in plain English?
It just means that if a contract depends on a very specific person or thing continuing to exist, and that thing is destroyed without anyone's fault, performance is excused.
And this brings us to a famous case involving a fire. Let's analyze Taylor v. Caldwell. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
The defendant agreed to rent his music hall to the plaintiff for 4 concerts. But before the first concert, the music hall accidentally burned down. The plaintiff then sued for the money he'd spent on advertising and preparations.
And what was the core legal issue?
Is the owner liable for a breach of contract for failing to provide the hall when it was, completely destroyed by an accidental fire?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
This is the doctrine of impossibility via implied condition. It has three elements. One, the contract requires the continued existence of a specific thing. Two, that thing is destroyed or perishes. And three, the destruction occurred without the fault of either party.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, the requirement of a specific thing?
The court found that the parties must have contemplated that the music hall would continue to exist. I mean, it was the foundation of the whole deal. Without the hall, there could be no concert.
It was that hall, not just any hall.
Exactly. It was a specific thing.
Understood. Now, what about the second and third elements regarding the destruction?
Well, the facts were clear. The fire was accidental, so no one was at fault. And because the hall ceased to exist, that implied condition that the hall would be there, it failed.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
Both parties are excused. The owner doesn't have to provide the hall or pay damages, and the renter doesn't have to pay the rent. The loss lies where it falls.
Okay, so that's impossibility. The thing is gone, so I can't perform. That's pretty intuitive. But what about situations where performance is physically possible, but the whole reason for the contract is gone?
Now you're getting into the much trickier doctrine of frustration of purpose.
And I think we have the perfect case for this. It's one of the coronation cases. Let's analyze Krell v. Henry. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Right. So the defendant rented the plaintiff's apartment on Pall Mall for 2 days. The whole point was to get a prime view of King Edward VII's coronation procession. The price was, astronomical. But then the king got appendicitis, and the whole parade was canceled.
So the defendant refused to pay the rest of the rent.
He did.
And what was the core legal issue?
The issue is the tenant excused from paying when the specific event that motivated the rental is canceled, even though occupying the room is still physically possible?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
This is frustration of purpose. The key elements here are: 1, the event was the foundation of the contract; 2, the event was prevented by an unanticipated supervening cause; and 3, performance remains possible but is rendered pointless.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this. How did the court apply the first element, the foundation of the contract?
The court looked beyond the written words. It noted the super high price, the location, the timing. It was obvious from the circumstances that watching the coronation was the sole reason for this contract. It was its foundation.
Understood. Now, what about the third element, the pointlessness of performance? The room was still there. He could still sit in it.
He could, yes. But the court said that because the procession was canceled, the value of that room for those 2 days was essentially destroyed. The transaction had, and this is the great quote, lost its identity.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The tenant is excused from paying the balance. The contract was discharged because its purpose was frustrated.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it feels like a slippery slope. What are the limits? What if performance just becomes really difficult or, a lot more expensive than I thought?
And that is the crucial question. This brings us to the modern limits: commercial impracticability and, most importantly, assumption of risk.
So this is where the courts draw the line.
This is absolutely where they draw the line. The rule for impracticability is that there has to be an extreme and unreasonable difficulty or expense. But the real killer element is that the party seeking excuse must not have assumed the risk of that event happening.
Let's test this with a case from World War II. Let's analyze Lloyd v. Murphy. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Okay, so in August 1941, the defendant leased a piece of land specifically to open a new car dealership. War was escalating in Europe. After Pearl Harbor in December, the U.S. government severely restricted the sale of all new cars. The dealer then stopped paying rent, claiming his business purpose was frustrated.
And what was the core legal issue?
Is a commercial lease excused by government wartime restrictions that make the intended business much less profitable but not totally impossible?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
The court really focused on assumption of risk in frustration cases. The test it used had 2 main elements. 1, was the supervening event reasonably foreseeable? And 2, is the value of the lease totally or near totally destroyed?
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis, step by step. How did the court apply the first element, foreseeability?
This was the nail in the coffin for the dealer. The court pointed out the lease was signed in late 1941. War was imminent. Everyone knew it. The court basically said, this risk was foreseeable. You didn't put a clause in the contract about it, so you implicitly assumed that risk.
Understood. Now, what about the second element? The total destruction of value. He couldn't sell new cars, which is a whole point.
Right, but the court said the value wasn't totally destroyed. The dealer could still sell used cars. He could repair cars. He could sublet the property. It wasn't pointless, just, a lot less profitable. And the lot of excuse does not protect you from a bad bargain.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
No excuse. The tenant remains liable for the rent. Foreseeability killed his claim.
I want to make sure this distinction is crystal clear for everyone listening. Let's run through a few quick, visceral hypotheticals.
Let's do it.
Okay, the specific cow, hypo. A farmer agrees to sell my prize cow, Bessie. The night before delivery, Bessie is struck by lightning and dies. Excused or not?
Excused. That's classic impossibility. The specific subject matter of the contract, Bessie, is gone through no fault of his own.
Good. Now, the generic potato hypo. A farmer agrees to sell 1,000 bushels of potatoes. No specific field is mentioned. A blight wipes out his entire crop. Excused or not?
Not excused. This is a common trap. Because the contract was for generic goods, he can go buy potatoes on the open market and fulfill his contract. It might be expensive, he might lose money, but it's not impossible. He assumed the market risk.
Brutal, but logical. Last one. The expensive gravel hypo. A contractor agrees to extract gravel from a specific piece of land. He starts digging and realizes most of the remaining gravel is underwater, and it will now cost 10 times the contract price to extract it. Excused or not?
Excused. Under the doctrine of impracticability. When the cost becomes so extreme, 10 times is the classic example, it crosses the line from merely difficult to legally impossible. The performance is commercially unreasonable.
Okay, fantastic. So we've covered the history, the cases, the doctrines. For the listeners out there who might be looking at a contract right now, let's synthesize this. Let's build an exam framework, a diagnostic checklist.
Absolutely. This is the step-by-step analysis you should use.
Step 1.
First, identify the supervening event. Did something unexpected happen after the contract was formed? A war, a fire, a new law. It has to happen after formation.
Step 2.
Second, check the basic assumption. Was the non-occurrence of this event a fundamental, unspoken assumption of the deal? Did the contract rely on that music hall standing or the king being healthy?
Okay, step 3.
Third, categorize the impact. And you have to be honest with yourself here. Is performance truly impossible, like the dead cow? Is the purpose totally frustrated, like the canceled parade? Or is it merely impracticable, meaning the cost is extreme and unreasonable, not just less profitable?
And finally, the most important step.
The killer element, step 4, assumption of risk. This is where most claims fail. Ask yourself, was this event foreseeable? If it was, you probably assumed the risk. Then check the contract. Is there a force majeure clause that covers this specific event? And who is in the better position to insure against the loss?
So after all that, what's the bottom line conclusion?
If the risk was allocated in the contract or it was foreseeable, then there is no excuse. But if it was a true bolt from the blue that destroyed the very foundation of the deal, then excuse is granted.
This all brings us right back to where we started with the COVID-19 pandemic.
It does. Thousands of businesses in 2020 dusted off their contracts and went straight to that force majeure clause. And, many of them found something terrifying.
Which was?
Many clauses listed things like acts of God, strikes, fires, but very few explicitly said pandemic or government shutdown.
And does that single word really matter that much?
It matters immensely. Courts are very strict. If you have the specific list of disasters and pandemic isn't on it, the assumption is often that you meant to leave it out. You assumed that risk.
So tying it back to our cases, many businesses were in the position of the car dealer in Lloyd v. Murphy.
Exactly. They could argue their purpose was frustrated, but courts would say, well, you could still do curbside pickup, you can still do takeout.
Yeah.
The value wasn't totally destroyed, just diminished, so no excuse.
It really just underscores that at their core, contracts are tools for allocating risk. When the world breaks, the contract tells you who has to pick up the pieces.
That is the bottom line. The law assumes you're an adult who can foresee the future, or at least buy insurance against it.
So a final provocative thought for everyone listening.
Check your force majeure clause right now. Don't just gloss over the boilerplate language at the end of your contracts. Does it just say act of God? Or does it specifically list pandemic because that one word could save your business millions?
A sobering, but very practical piece of advice. Thanks for diving in with us today.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.